Good afternoon. The topic of this session will be the nature of free will. We will try to tackle this issue from the viewpoints of our ordinary self-understanding, neuroscience, and philosophy. My name is Bojana Grujicic, and I'm currently a PhD student in the Max Planck School of Cognition. I'm primarily interested in philosophy of science and the question of the nature of explanation in neuroscience. And I'll be talking today to Professor John Dylan Haynes, whose research spans many areas, from brain decoding, machine learning, brain-computer interfaces, to visual perception, working memory, consciousness, and free will. After his PhD, he held numerous positions in Germany and the UK. He is the chair for theory and analysis of large-scale brain signals at Charité Universitätsmedizin Berlin, Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience, and the director of Berlin Center for Advanced Neuroimaging. Just so you know, if you have any kind of a comment or a question, feel free to tap it into the chat, and Angelina will be there to take note of your questions and transmit them to us. This question of the nature of free will is somehow sits nicely at the intersection between neuroscience, philosophy, and our ordinary self-understanding. For centuries, philosophers debated the nature of free will, motivated primarily with two considerations, I think. So one was the interest in moral responsibility. So people thought that free will is somehow a necessary condition for moral responsibility, so that unless we're really free and unless we're able to somehow appropriately control our actions, we can't be truly morally responsible for our actions. So we wouldn't say that we are truly deserving the blame and praise that we're getting, and that we can be somehow rightfully punished for our wrong actions. And the second motivation sprang from trying to somehow reconcile the possibility of us being free in a deterministic world. So according to determinism, every state that ensues follows directly from what happened at a previous time point and the natural laws that govern the development of the system. So if universe is deterministic, how can we be free, right? And then several decades ago, neuroscience came into this position and was able to tackle the nature of free will and provided these very controversial evidence that there are unconscious precursors or preparatory brain activities before the occurrence of conscious intention to make a movement, and this generated a lot of discussion that was very fruitful and very interdisciplinary between philosophers and neuroscientists. But because this notion of free will seems to be of such importance for our everyday self-understanding, I think it would be really good to start from trying to tackle this everyday understanding that we have, because this intuition that we're acting freely is so deeply embedded in our regular experience, and it seems to me to be one of the defining features that it is this conscious me who is making a choice to drink coffee instead of tea, and who could have chosen to do something else. I'm interested in this everyday intuition of our ability to act freely that your lab tried to parse scientifically a bit more. And what were your findings, and how do people understand this?
Yeah, so the topic of free will is one that is notoriously ill-defined. And that is because everybody who talks about free will thinks about something different. And what then happens is that neuroscientists come along and say, we know free will is this, and then philosophers come along and they say, we know that free will is that. And then you get another philosopher and they say, well, that's not true, something else. So you end up with this kind of collection of different opinions, what free will could even be.
Absolutely.
So, and then you ask a layperson and they say, well, I don't really know what that means, free will, but I have this idea what it might mean. Mm-hmm. And I think there are different aspects there. So typically, if you ask lay people whether an action or a decision is free, so let's just say a person takes a pen and the person just tries out the pen on a piece of paper. Mm-hmm. It just scribbles around. And you'd say, well, was this action free? Most people would agree, yeah, that action is free. Yeah. So if you just do something where there are no constraints on what you do, there's no one telling you, you have to scribble this, and there's no inner logic or reason why you should scribble something specific, then people think that's free. Free means, some people call this the freedom of indifference. Yeah. It just means I couldn't care less, so who cares, I'm just going to do whatever. But I don't feel constrained. And then you can see that people can feel constrained. They can feel constrained by external circumstances. For example, if you're holding a gun to their head and you say, get me some money from your bank account, otherwise I'm going to shoot you, they will not feel free in this action. And interestingly, people can also feel constrained by the internal logic of the situation. So some philosophers have defined freedom, free will, as not being to do with any kind of lack of determination, but as people being able to follow their own reasons and motives when they make decisions. So if I, have a cup of coffee and a cup of tea, and I can take one of the two, and if I can then take what I want, I don't care if that's determined. As long as it's determined by my reasons, that's absolutely fine.
Yes.
But actually, so that's a very classical philosophical position. But actually, if you ask lay people, they don't consider these kind of decisions free typically. So a classic example is, say you come to an intersection and you can go to the left or go to the right and there's no real difference where the way goes. And you say, well, is this decision free? And people will say, yes, that decision is, it's a free decision. And then you say, well, if you turn left, there's nothing. But if you go to the right, you're going to get €1 million. And you can only get them if you go to the right. Then people will think of this as a non-free decision. They feel that there's some necessity that they have to take the option that gives them the reward, that gives them this money, because they can't go without this money. They can't just forsake the money. So this just shows an example where the intuitions that lay people have about what counts as free are quite different than these technical definitions that we sometimes use in philosophy or in neuroscience. And then there's another dimension to this problem, which is that often we consider the freedom to have something to do with staying in contradiction to determination. So let's say I make a decision, I can take coffee or tea, and I feel when I make this decision, I might have a leaning one or the other way, but I somehow feel when I make this decision, if there's no external constraint, nobody expecting me to take the coffee or the tea or something like that, then we typically believe that a decision like that is free in the sense that we could change our mind and we can change the course of the universe, and it really depends on only primarily what we decide at that point in time, and that can lead the universe to go one or the other way. And this is something that's called alternate possibilities, and so the people feel when they don't feel constrained when they make these decisions. They feel that it's still open. They can still have an influence. It's not constrained yet. It's not determined what's going to happen. And this is something that has to do with the fact that people are, you might say, closet dualists, which means that they believe that the mind and the brain are somewhat separable, and you can make a decision in your mind. It's got nothing to do with your brain, first of all. It just happens in your mind space. And then you can then bring an action about that then triggers something in your body that brings about, then you do something in the world. So I'd say there are these multiple aspects of lay intuition. So first of all, just to summarize that, So first of all, there is the issue of dualism, that people think that they're actually not constrained by the laws of the universe, by the physics or the physiology of the body. And then there's this other aspect that people feel that they can still do otherwise, which presumably has to do with this dualism, and that they feel most free when there are no reasons or external constraints or even internal constraints when they have to make a decision.
That's really interesting, because I do agree that there are contexts in life where we do act in unconstrained ways, and in contexts where we would have this liberty of indifference that you mentioned. But it does strike me to be somehow the primary locus of our ordinary understanding of freedom, because it does seem to me that very often we are able to, stand back and rationalize what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, and that is somehow more the locus of importance and what sort of signalizes what matters to us in a way. And I wonder whether in these contexts of indifference there isn't some kind of like umbrella reason, nevertheless, that we're due to which we choose to do what we do. So I don't know, if we go to a supermarket and I need milk, but I don't really care which item I exactly pick. So it is a moment of choosing something somewhat indifferently. But I just wonder whether in the background I'm not determined in a way, nevertheless, in the sense that I'm there because I need milk, right? So I just wonder whether the fact that we do not, that we commonsensically take liberty of indifference as the primary locus of freedom negates that we are determined in this context, because there could be some macro level determinants of our actions there too.
So I don't think that people deliberately think about this and think that, oh, I'm free when I'm completely unconstrained and I can be completely arbitrary. So when you ask me about what lay people think, I'm trying to give an explanation of an account of when do people feel free, just empirically observing them, asking them questions. When do you feel free?
Yes.
Not when they should feel free, or even if they have reasons why they feel one or the other way. But it's about their spontaneous, intuitive, subjective experience, which is, would you say, are you free here in this situation or not? And in those cases, I think this a kind of lack of determination, the ability to do otherwise, the kind of ability to have a mind that is separable from your body, and the lack of any kind of logical constraints that would kind of push you to take one alternative. I think that describes when people feel free.
Right.
And I think these labels like freedom of indifference, I think that's a little bit derogatory and dismissive, because it sounds like it's not the real kind of freedom. And when we say freedom, we mean something else. But I'd be careful there, because I think it's important to not confuse what one would professionally think as a neuroscientist, a psychologist, or a philosopher, and what lay people think. And lay people, I don't think, make this difference between freedom of indifference and then the real freedom based on reasons. I think we've got very good reasons to believe that lay people consider reasons to actually be something a little bit more of a constraint sometimes, rather than something that contributes to their freedom. Of course, that doesn't mean that when we describe people's behavior as scientists, of course, reasons play a role, causes play a role, motivation plays a role. All these things suddenly start playing a role, which means that that's exactly where you end up in the situation where science brings this lay idea of freedom into question. Because you think, well, lay people think that this is freedom, but we know that, for example, presumably this degree of alternate possibilities when I make a decision, that I can kind of still change the way the universe is going to happen, it's not predetermined. I think these beliefs, or that the mind is separable from the brain, these beliefs are not, it's just not true. I mean, we've got, I would say, a little bit softer, we've got very good scientific reasons to believe that this is not true. And I think that's the tension between scientific results and lay beliefs. And this is quite interesting because then you end up in a debate with, say, for example, philosophers. And philosophers have the kind of, I'd say, scientifically evolved concepts from their discipline in mind.
Yeah.
And then you have like this triad where like lay people say, this is how I make my decision. And this brain scientist says, no, you don't make your decision like that. And then a philosopher comes along and says, well, no, actually, freedom is compatible with determinism. It's possible. But that's not what lay people think. It's what a philosopher might think. And there might be very good reasons for thinking that or conceptualizing freedom in that way. But it's not what the lay people think, I don't think.
Right, interesting. So, I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit more about these neuroscientific findings that tackle this dualism that is so deeply entrenched?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I think that there's a history there, and I don't really buy into that history anymore. So my opinion about the meaning of these neuroscientific results has changed over the years. So if you go back many years, say, to the early 1980s, there was a very famous experiment by an American neuroscientist. His name was Benjamin Libet. And what he found was, so what was known at that time is that if people make simple movements with their hand, for example, they flex their wrist, and they can choose whenever they want to do it. So it's a spontaneous thing. It's not like I give you a beep and then you have to move, but you can do it whenever you feel like making this movement. Footnote, whatever that might mean. Yeah. So then you can do whenever you feel like it. And of course, people feel like it, at least they move. And it's not normally observed that people then just say, well, I don't really feel like it. I'm not going to do this. Yeah. So it's like, so there's some, people do some role playing when they play the experiments, I think.
Yeah.
And then, so people make these movements, and what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to let the experimenter know when they made up their mind. So you're sitting there, you're not flexing your wrist, but then you think, oh, okay, now I'm going to do it. And then you want to know, when is this now I'm going to do it? When does that happen? So the way Libet did this experiment was that he had a rotating point on the display that rotated about every 2.5 seconds. And people were asked to memorize when this dot was when they made up their mind. And he did lots of control experiments just to make sure that the timing is roughly right. And what he found was that people actually have a brain signal before they think they're making up their mind. So if you record their brain signal with an EEG, so basically you record the voltage on the scalp, then what you see is that the signal on the scalp becomes more negative, goes more towards negative, already around half a second before you move, but still a few hundred milliseconds before you think you're making up your mind. So when you feel you're making up your mind now, so you're resting and you think, well, you know, at some point I'm going to have to flex my wrist. And you say, I'm not going to do it now, I'm not going to do it, now I'm going to do it. And you remember the time, and then you move. Actually, before this, now I'm going to do it. A few hundred milliseconds before that, there is a brain signal that you can observe. Mm-hmm. And the interpretation, or one of the interpretations of this brain signal, and there's a huge debate about this in science, and it's reinvigorated over the last couple of years. But one of the interpretations is that what's happened is that the brain made an early decision. So when I think I'm making up my mind now, if I were to go back in time 200 or 300 milliseconds, my brain is really making up its mind, whatever that might mean again, you know. And then 200 or 300 milliseconds later, somehow there's a little bit of a latency, and then my mind kicks in. But when my mind thinks I'm doing it now, actually everything has already been predetermined. Mm-hmm. So that's the challenge of the Libet experiment, which is that at this time when we think we're making a decision now, possibly everything has predetermined from prior brain activity. Now, this is something that you have to be a little bit aware of the intricacies of interpreting brain science data. So for many years, people thought that this is a plausible explanation. They thought, well, okay, so the brain signal comes first and then you decide. So presumably the brain signal is the cause of the decision. But you have to be a bit careful there because it can mean quite different things. Mm-hmm. So for example, it could be a statistical effect. Like the brain roughly knows when you're going to decide. It has an expectation about roughly when you're going to decide. And it just starts preparing, but actually you could still, for example, change your mind or something like that, or not decide or something like that. Mm. And so the kind of the link between these signals, whether every time you get one of these early brain signals, they're called readiness potentials, you automatically make a decision, or when you don't get a readiness potential, you can't make a decision. So the link between these effects is not that clear. Even to the current day, it's not that clear. But that's the challenge of the Libet experiment, is that it seems that to support determinism, at first sight, if you look at it, you think, oh, well, the decision is caused by the prior brain signal. If you drill into it, you realize it's not quite that simple. And subsequently, people have looked at this. And for example, we did some brain imaging studies with functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and it's a slightly slower brain signal, but it allows us to resolve the brain in more detail. And we found that you could even sometimes see the kind of upcoming decision several seconds before people think they're making these decisions. Mm-hmm. So we kind of took this a few years later, actually almost 20 years later, we took this and we, more than 25 years later, sorry, we took these experiments and tried to see if we can somehow quantify the link between these early brain signals and the subsequent decision. And we found that you could do this, you could make this prediction, but the prediction wasn't perfect. So that could mean, say, for example, that the brain signals do not perfectly predict the decision. So it's not like, it might just be more like a nudge. It's not actually a deterministic cause. Or it could mean that we have to measure the brain signals better because our brain scanners and EEGs are great, but they still have their limitations. So, this whole predictive element, predicting a decision from brain signals, is not really useful for supporting determinism. But it was taken to mean that many years, but I don't think it really kind of serves well in this job. And I think we need to look for other ways in which we can make these kind of claims.
Interesting. So, but why did people then originally think determinism did follow from Libet's findings? I mean...
Because they didn't think about these things clear enough. I mean, I think the debate was a little bit... it went all over the place.
Yeah.
There were so many things. People doubted that Libet could really tell when the decision was made, whether it's a natural task, a kind of very artificial way of deciding when you're making a decision. People said this was a classic. Well, you don't make a decision when you're kind of flexing your wrist once. You're actually making the decision when you decide to participate in the experiment. Right. I'd say, well, they're actually two different experiments, two different decisions. One is, am I going to participate in the experiment? The other one is, on every trial, I have to decide when I'm going to make up my mind. That's not something you decide at the beginning of the experiment. You don't say, I'm going to go and participate in this experiment. On the first trial, I'm going to take 1 second. On the second trial, I'm going to take 1.5 seconds. On the third trial, I'm going to take 0.7 seconds, and so on. You don't do that. So these are different decisions at different levels of granularity. But there's like a whole microcosm of debate around this. And I actually think at the heart of it, it's not really suitable for arguing for determinism. Because, for example, we subsequently did an experiment where we showed that, so this was something you could only do much later because the technology wasn't really there to do this. So we recorded people's brain activity with EEG in real time, so really fast. And we trained a computer to recognize when a person was starting to prepare the decision. Mm-hmm. And what we then did was the idea was, well, if this early brain signal determines that then later you're going to make this movement, can you really is it something that's inevitable that it's going to happen? Or can you somehow break this causal chain? So an analogy for this is like you have a series of domino stones and you topple one over. And when you've done this is the starting point, the brain signal. Is this automatically going to run through something you call a ballistic process? Like when you shoot a cannon, you can't correct the trajectory of the cannonball on the way. So that's ballistic. You can't, you start it and then it just happens. You got no way of controlling it. Or can you, for example, control it halfway, for example, by taking a domino stone out and preventing that this whole process is going to run through? Mm-hmm. And we found actually that you could do that. Mm-hmm. So what that suggests is that these early brain signals don't really support this idea of determinism. I'm not saying that then when you kind of change your mind or you're challenged to change your mind, that this is not deterministic, but it's just not the right way to go about showing this.
But I mean, I'm not sure really that goes against determinism. I understand this ballistic point, but you could probably, yeah.
I wouldn't say that these experiments suggest that it's not deterministic.
Right.
But it just means that the whole picture is much more complicated, and that ultimately, I wouldn't say that these experiments show there's no determinism, but they show that the other experiments can't positively show that there's determinism.
Right.
So it's more taking an argument out of the game. It's not bringing a new argument in, but it's taking an argument out of the game, I think.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, so I was wondering, maybe just to go back to kind of sketch what this neuroscientific concept of free will was. Then we heard a bit more about lay people's concept, but the way Libet imagined or understood what free will is was quite specific to this whole discourse. So one thing that he would sort of assume was that actions have to be endogenous, meaning that they need to have this internal origin in me and not be purely reactive to some external stimulus that is presented to me. And another point was that there needs to be this conscious control over the action or conscious initiation of the action, and that because we found out about these unconscious determinants of our action, we aren't really free. And so I just wonder, okay, determinism on the side, what these findings in general say about this aspect of conscious states being somehow causally possibly involved in the initiation of action. Because, okay, we acknowledge that dualism is out of the picture. We acknowledge some kind of dependence of the mental states onto our brain states. But I just wonder, so how did these subsequent findings tackle this notion that perhaps it's not the neural correlates of our conscious states that are causally involved in the initiation of action, but the unconscious states, which does seem to be still somewhat preposterous for our ordinary self-understanding.
Well, I do think that when you start discussing these issues, that then you start slightly moving away from free will, and you move slowly towards responsibility and attribution of actions to conscious or unconscious states and things like that. So,
right.
So it's a slightly different issue. But my way of framing this is to say, well, let's just say, and I'm not saying this, I actually say that the Libet experiments are irrelevant. I don't think that they contribute very much to the problem. But another way of looking at the question is, well, even if it starts by some unconscious brain activity, and I believe that is definitely the case, when you have a decision, I'm going to do this, this doesn't come from nowhere. I don't believe in dualism. So I believe that this is something that happens in the brain. And if it happens in the brain, it's subject to the causal mechanisms that describe brain processes.
Absolutely.
And I think actually that the key contribution that neuroscience has to make here is not to show that you can predict the decision. I mean, I can predict a decision if you're going to drink coffee or tea across a year, presumably, because if you like coffee now and you're a person who likes coffee or tea, in a year it's presumably going to be the same. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that these predictive aspects really, they're not tight enough. But what neuroscience has definitely shown is that there are brain signals that are what you might call the instantiation or the neural realization of the decision or the conscious decision, oh, I'm going to do this, and there's a brain pattern. And because this is realized by the brain, it inherits all the causal mechanisms that just happen in the brain, and these neurons that are kind of implementing your decision, I'm going to move now, they are causally embedded in the rest of the brain, and they're subject to these causal processes. So I think that's why I wouldn't say that this kind of rules out determinism or not, and then you can start discussing about what determinism means until the end of days. And you'll find out that if you take it seriously, you're going to have to repeat the history of the universe to really satisfy a philosophical tight belief that you've demonstrated determinism, which is empirically very difficult to do, repeating the history of the universe. So I think what the neuroscience contributes is to say, well, here's the neural representation of my decision. And now you can start asking interesting questions. You can say, well, where does it come from? What is it influenced by? Backwards looking. So you can say, well, here it is. Hey, I'm going to move my hand now. This is my brain signal related to, hey, I'm going to move my hand now. And you look backwards, you can say, where is it coming from? What is it influenced by?
Right.
You might think of something like the kind of backwards looking event horizon of things that could have influenced this. And you can look forwards. What does it in turn influence? You can say, well, for example, what would have been different if I hadn't had this brain process that realizes my conscious intention? So you got something in your brain, and that process can either be coffee or tea. So I'm going to decide I'm going to take coffee. I'm going to decide I'm going to make tea. And this is like has some brain process associated with it. Is this then part of the causal process that leads up to the action? It could be that our conscious decision has got nothing to do with what we actually do. For example, it could be that our conscious decision is bypassed. I mean, this is hypothetical. Well, just think about again about domino stones. So just say you got like a long row of domino stones, and the beginning is the unconscious brain signal. Somewhere in the middle, you've got some decisive process, kind of like if you don't pass the dominoes there, then kind of the action is not going to happen, and at the end you trigger an action. And now you've got two possibilities. Either your conscious decision is one of these domino stones that sits in this kind of long row, sits in the middle, and if you don't have a conscious decision, because these domino stones are not toppled over, you're not going to move.
Right.
Another possibility is actually that it's like a sidetrack. So what philosophers then call epiphenomenal. So basically you have like a bifurcation, a branch, and one thing goes to your consciousness and the other goes to the action. Now that might sound completely crazy, but then it might not be that crazy after all, because it depends on what you think, what the neuromechanisms of consciousness are. So now we've got the neuromechanisms of free will. We don't really know what they are. And then we've got the neuromechanisms of consciousness. And it could, for example, be, I'm just speculating here, this is not my personal theory, but you could, if you're a person who believes that consciousness is just kind of like a superficial bird's eye view of what's happening in your brain that then goes into memory for episodic memory or something like that, so that you remember what your decisions were. It could be that it's actually not part of the track that leads to the movement. And there are many decisions for actions that we make unconsciously and where we move unconsciously. I mean, your posture, for example, you don't think about, am I going to move my leg this way or that way? Do I sit on the left or on the right? I mean, there are many decisions that we just don't make consciously. So I think this is an issue that is very interesting. We don't really know enough about that because we don't understand the causal embedding of the neural carrier of the conscious decision to move. That's the actual problem. And it's actually quite important because as far as I understand in the US, in law, there is this idea of mens rea. And the idea is that you have to show that the conscious intention to do the action is part of what leads to the action.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So this is very abstract, but at the same time, it has the conceptual analysis actually has direct implications. For example, for legal systems in certain countries.
Interesting. So I wonder whether neuroscience then is in a position, in principle, right now to tackle these questions of, to which extent the mechanism of or the neural correlate of a conscious state is somehow implicated in this or not. Do we have some findings related to that, or is this something to come?
Well, I think the first thing we have, as I mentioned just now, is that we have a rough idea about where the conscious intention is located in the brain.
Right.
Which is part of the story, because the anatomy already just can tell you something about what can or what might not happen, what the kind of possible pathways are, how your actions come about. But I have to say, I think that what neuroscience does is it gives us a framework for thinking about intentions. In general, I don't think that neuroscience is far enough to be able to claim that we have a complete mechanistic understanding of the human mind. What we're trying to do is we're trying to explain the mind, but I don't think that we can really say, well, this individual decision happened in the brain in this very specific way, because there are far too many degrees of freedom and possibilities how brain processes could come about. And we can't measure brain processes with sufficient detail today in order to be able to tell the full causal story. And I think that's why it's really important for neuroscientists. I mean, it's okay to kind of propagate a way of thinking about these processes, but I think it's also important to think to clearly communicate what you can and what you can't say based on neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. And so does contemporary neuroscience still refer to these preparatory brain signals as somehow being able to tell us something extremely important about whether we have free will or not? What's the state of the discourse in a way?
I think the preparatory brain signals don't really contribute to the problem. I think the implementation aspect contributes to the problem, and then you need a causal analysis. So that will be the path that I would take.
Right.
And it seems, I think that the tide is going away from the little bit experiments in neuroscience as well. So I think they were really interesting landmarks in kind of the history of cognitive neuroscience. But I also think that they've had their day, and I don't think that we can learn that much today from these choice predictive brain signals. I mean, we've studied them, but today, if I look back, I'd say I think that they don't really contribute as much as you might think. They're interesting paradoxes to amuse first semester students. They're like riddles, and they're good for cocktail parties and things like that. But I think if you really look at the problem, you realize that these choice predictive brain signals don't really contribute too much to this issue.
I see. Right. So maybe then, so we kind of said something about the lay people's concept and neuroscientific one. So maybe we can discuss a little bit how philosophers understood what free will is. And so in contrast to this lay people's concept, I don't think philosophers accentuated the role of dualism. We do acknowledge that mental states are dependent upon brain states. And in contrast to this neuroscientific concept, also, we do not necessarily stress the importance of conscious intentions immediately preceding our movements as something that is necessarily causally relevant. And this idea of actions having somehow to be endogenous also was not the very central idea, because the whole discussion in philosophy historically revolves around the topic of determinism and whether free will is compatible with determinism. And in general, people in philosophical discourse, whether they are compatibilists or not, see free will or free actions as somehow based on reasons. And again, not necessarily conscious deliberation immediately preceding the action. But the idea is that we need to be able, in some sense, to rationalize which aspects of our actions we take to be somehow appealing or desired or wanted, why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And I think this in part sprang from observing different kinds of actions we do in everyday life. So as you mentioned, in some contexts we do choose things in a somewhat indifferent way, so we're just picking something, let's say. But in many spheres of life we have certain aims that matter to us, and we have reasons for acting the way we do in light of certain beliefs and desires. So that's one thing. And I think also people observed this difference between people who are able to, let's say, control themselves adequately and people who do not in some contexts, like neurotics or compulsives, who seem not to be acting based on reasons, and we do not want to attribute freedom to them, right? And So philosophers somehow then weren't really historically happy, given this analysis of freedom, with how neuroscience tried to tackle this notion, because they would say, neuroscientific studies just dealt with this sort of unimportant type of freedom. It's not that it's not freedom, but it is a relatively unimportant thing that we end up doing in lives. What is your impression of this notion of freedom as something based on reasons?
So first of all, I mean, in these discussions between neuroscientists, I think of myself as a neuroscientist and a psychologist at the same time, which I am. And I also studied a lot of philosophy, so I think I kind of see myself as a little bit of a mixture between these different breeds. And first of all, I like to say that when there are these disagreements, I think they're really useful. It's really useful to have these discussions. And one of the reasons why I volunteered to run the master program with the Berlin School of Mind and Brain was that this master program deliberately allows for these kind of questions about consciousness and free will and embodiment and things like that. And to just kind of clarify which of these concepts make sense, which don't. And so that means working together with philosophers. And I've always enjoyed working with philosophers, and I've published with philosophers, with various philosophers. And so that we don't always agree doesn't mean that I would discredit philosophy.
Right.
I do think that sometimes this happens the other way around, which I consider a little bit kind of destructive.
Right.
I'd say, actually, that I would say that there are three positions that are relevant, also related to what we discussed just now. One is a libertarianism, which is just basically one way of thinking about this is dualism. Yeah, you say, well, there's no problem if the universe is deterministic, because my decisions are not made with my mind. The part of my mind that is related to my brain is just something else. It's kind of free from determination through the body. So that's one possibility. That's one possible move. And I'd actually say that that's what most lay people do. And there are some philosophers who are also kind of in this camp. Then you have the hard determinists. I mean, the philosophy is not just one camp. There are different people in philosophy, and you have the hard determinists. And then you have this whole kind of, I'd say, fashionable, majority of philosophers are compatibilists. And they then come in different flavors as well. So ultimately, the question is, well, it doesn't really matter if I feel free with respect to irrelevant things in my life. So, for example, wiggling my hand or something like that. Right. What is important is my decisions based on my beliefs and desires. Whatever, I commit a crime and it's for my own good, but I'm not taking into account the fact that people are damaged and someone might be harmed. Oh my God, you made that decision. Right. Fully knowing all the consequences. Right. And knowing that it was wrong, etc., etc. So I think, I mean, no psychologist or neuroscientist would say that that doesn't exist. I mean, right. Obviously, people in psychology and in neuroscience know that there is moral behavior and that people adjust their behavior to rules, to norms, whatever, and to punishment, etc., etc. It's not about whether this is a thing or not. Okay. There are different kinds of decisions. There are these more arbitrary decisions, and there are these more kind of rule, moral, reason, reward-based decisions. And I would say, I think we'd agree on roughly the world consists of, yeah? And we could possibly even agree what the brain mechanisms are. I think actually the disagreement is what we want to call free and what we want to call responsible. And I think this is where this discussion comes up. I think that scientists use the term freedom for alternate possibilities, for breaking out of the causal constraints of the universe. And I think that's why scientists don't think that there is this freedom in that sense. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect, they would say that's moral behavior, reason-based behavior, etc. But they wouldn't call that free. They would just not use the term free for that. And I think in philosophy, and this is, I'm just going to this is a very short sketch now, obviously. Obviously, all this plays a big role. My ability to adjust my behavior, my reasons, my decisions on rules, on beliefs, desires, rewards, etc., is really important for my behavior. And it's also important, I think, for whether you want to consider someone responsible or not. I mean, if you do something automatically, it's not so bad as if it's deliberate. And if you do something based on a reflex, it's not so bad. So if you were to kill someone because you trigger a knee-jerk reflex that then triggers a gun or something, you'd say, well, the person is not responsible for that, unless they triggered their knee-jerk reflex. But if someone else were to do that, right, and they couldn't help themselves, you would say, well, you're not responsible for that. So the regulation level through which an action flows, whether it's purely reflex or it's something that goes through habits, or it goes through, because you can also be responsible for letting your habits come about, or whether a specific decision really is deliberate, you kind of think about the pros and cons and all the reasons and so on. This is, of course, really important, but I don't think it makes that much sense to call it free. And I would actually say, and I realize that this is a controversial point, and I might get lots of emails about this, but I would say, I think that, and this is the only point where I'm going to say something controversial now, I hope, which is that I think this is, I'd say, a figure of thought in philosophy where certainly Western philosophers are trained to think of freedom as a necessary condition for responsibility. Yes. So that means, now you can argue that way, I mean, but that means, and this is the bit that's not so good, that responsibility has to have the same properties as freedom. It has to inherit the properties of being reason-based from freedom. And I think that's the bit that doesn't work. I think the reason philosophers care so much about freedom is because they think that freedom brings you the reason responsiveness and the kind of morals and the reward orientation, all this kind of complex, deliberate stuff. So they want to kind of somehow export it into freedom so that they can import it into responsibility. Right. And I would actually go another way. I would say, well, just use words in a sensible way, and also don't use words in a way that is very counterintuitive to lay people. You can, of course, use terminology in a counterintuitive way. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you then go into interdisciplinary debates or debates with kind of the general public, I think you should then have to say, well, sorry guys, I keep saying that I'm going to say free will with my compatibilistic arguments, but the compatibilistic free will that I'm saving here is not the free will that you're thinking of when you're talking about free will. I'm actually doing something completely different here, but I'm not telling you. So I think that sometimes there's a little bit of kind of not thinking this through, or possibly even a slight dishonesty in there. And you have to think about what's a sensible way of using this terminology. And I'd say, I think it makes perfect sense to use freedom more for this sense of alternate possibilities, and to use the kind of rule-based, reason-based, reward-based guidance of behavior, to use responsibility for that. And I think these two should be kept separate. We don't need to import this artificially from freedom. And I mean, we've shown this in experiments where we've kind of probed lay people and shown that people think that freedom is not always that kind of important as a foundation for responsibility. So I can give you an example for this. If you take this bifurcation example where you come to a branch on the street and you go to the left and to the right, and no matter what you take, the outcome is the same. So you say, well, is the person responsible for choosing one or the other? They might say yes. Are they free? Yes. But then you say, well, I'm going to give you 1 million euros on one of the branches and nothing on the other. And you say, is the person free? You'd say, no, they're not free, because they have to take the money. They feel internally coerced to take the money. But are they responsible? Yes, they are responsible for taking the money. So I think that lay people, if you look at it carefully, actually very well make a distinction between freedom and responsibility. So I think you can stick to technical terms, obviously, but then when you enter a common debate with lay people or people from other disciplines, you should definitely make clear that this is a very technical term that's very different than the way it is used in other fields.
Right.
And I think it's really important that we should stick to something that is as intuitive as possible, so we don't get all these costs at the interdisciplinary interfaces. So when we start talking to people, whatever, in law philosophy, or we talk to people in moral philosophy or theology or wherever, we might want to make sure that we're using terminology that is not very cryptic and counterintuitive. We might want to lean towards something that is more agreeable. And so I think it makes sense to use these more common sense terms.
Interesting. I just wonder whether if we do not attribute freedom to people, but want to say that they are responsible morally nevertheless, I just wonder whether we can say that they are truly morally responsible, because yes, people are able to control themselves, as you said. We do regulate our behavior based on reasons and rules and so on. But there is this sense that really the fact that I ended up being an agent who can control myself in these ways, that we do find somehow legally and just like morally relevant, does not seem to me to be enough to really attribute genuine moral responsibility to myself, unless I was really able to do otherwise, and that I'm somehow deserving this praise or blame I'm getting. It seems to me that if I'm like a genuine free will skeptic, which I tend to be, I tend to think that no, there is no sense in which I am truly morally responsible. We can say, yes, we can still keep our practices for certain benefits of, keeping the society tight and, keeping offenders away and stuff like that. So very consequentialist vindication of this practice. But I wouldn't really say that, unless I was able to do otherwise, I am genuinely morally responsible for this.
Yeah, I think, I might follow your reasoning there, actually, and I'd say that there is the normative fallacy, which is that, there is no way to argue for the right and wrong of things just based on facts. And I actually think that's correct. I think for norms and morals, you need like an internal perspective and values. They are like a set of fictitious entities that are used in regulating interpersonal behavior.
Right.
I don't think that there is an absolute justification of a certain moral. I think there are very good reasons, but I don't think there's like an absolute justification. It doesn't mean that you can't describe what consequences having these moral systems has on human societies, and it could have beneficial if your aim is to increase a trust and things like that between people. It can be very beneficial, but I don't think there's a hard reason to say one is correct and the other is incorrect. So, but I do think that we need to make a distinction in our, at least in our legal system, between different ways in which actions come about. And you could then say, well, as soon as something is based on reasons and motives, etc., it's a part that I can actually address. I can control, I can influence people, I can possibly get people to behave correctly or incorrectly. I can't do that with a reflex, but I can do that as soon as I have whatever morals and kind of commonly agreed upon standards for what good behavior is, what the desirable behavior is. Mm-hmm. So, I just want to keep the kind of the normative side of things, or the side of kind of like rules and beliefs and kind of guiding your behavior on this kind of complex macroscopic cognitive processes, separate from the issue of freedom. I actually think that I mean, the topic of freedom is a red herring. It's everybody wants it, and nobody really knows what it is. So, but everybody wants to say free will, and then they're very happy if someone comes along and says, "We all know that freedom is compatible with determinism."
Yeah.
And they're all very happy because you've saved free will, and you can tap on your shoulder and you say, "Well, I'm a great guy, and I've saved freedom." But actually, what you've saved is not what people want; it's something different. But you don't tell them. So I think that we should just be a little bit more careful and not keep talking about freedom and talk more about responsibility, and stop using freedom as a kind of precondition for responsibility.
Mm-hmm. But so you would say, just as the final remark, that even if people are not free, they could still be held to be morally responsible, like truly morally responsible.
Yes, I think so. If what they do is based on their beliefs, desires, I think we can hold people responsible. I think that's the criterion for holding people responsible. Of course, then you have to say, well, are people responsible for having a certain belief and desire? And I think we tend to say yes. If you look at extreme cases like pedophilia, for example, we say, well, I don't care for your excuses why you are pedophilic. It's just I hold you responsible for it anyway. So I think we don't do the second level analysis where we say, looking behind the kind of beliefs, desires, preferences, whatever people have, and say, well, you're not responsible for those. We kind of hold people responsible for having those as well.
Mm. Yeah. No, I do agree that we do tend to do that. I just wonder how legitimate the move is, because, again, they couldn't have done otherwise if you believe in determinism.
Well, there you go. Now, you're an incompatibilist, a hard determinist, and I'm what a philosopher, Walter Sinnott Armstrong, philosopher from the US, taught me he said I'm a semi-compatibilist. I'm still not quite sure if I'm a semi-compatibilist or a narrow compatibilist, but I'm definitely, I think that beliefs and desires and reasons are important when it comes to responsibility, and I think they're not important when it comes to freedom.
Yeah, I think that's a unique position, really. I don't think it's been analyzed that way in philosophy. Yeah, I think I'm leaning towards really free will skepticism and moral responsibility skepticism in this like true, genuine
You're
sense.
even more extreme than I am.
Yeah, I'm not saying we cannot justify the practices that we hold. I just think that unless we take ourselves to be free in some sense, which I don't think we are, we can't genuinely attribute. I can't really say that, I receive rightfully the blame or praise that I'm getting. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't have necessarily other reasons to keep the practices for attributing.
And you're going to get the blame anyway, because that's just the way the world is. You will be given the blame if someone finds out that you hurt them and you wanted to hurt them, and you did it deliberately, thinking about it. You are going to be blamed. It's just a fact of the world that you are blamed, however justified it might be or not.
We care about justification here. Okay, so I wanted to ask you just also how you see the role of philosophy in this discourse. You did say something about the fruitfulness of this interdisciplinary discussion, but yeah, be a bit more critical. What can we do better, and how to engage with neuroscientific findings in a fruitful way?
Well, first of all, I'd say that most philosophers I know who actually work as philosophers after their degree are very bright people and think a lot about stuff and in intelligent ways. So I think, first of all, it's good to have philosophers around. And I was once tempted to do a PhD in philosophy, actually, instead of neuroscience. Something I discussed with Achim Stefan from Osnabrück, and it's still like one of the paths in my kind of, sometimes I think, what would have happened if I'd done that?
If you would have done otherwise.
Yeah, if I'd done otherwise, exactly, which I didn't. It's an opportunity I missed out on, and I would have very much enjoyed. I'd say there is this good thing about philosophy, which is that it forces you to rethink the basic assumptions of your beliefs. So you just start thinking about things in a different way, and it also provides, I'd say, a justification framework where it's okay to do that. Mm-hmm. So in empirical sciences, this whole reflexive work where you just think about what do these data mean, writing review papers, opinion papers, it's not really regarded very highly. So raw, new empirical data, that's what people, you get credit for that. Mm-hmm. And this other stuff, this thinking stuff, is just not something that in empirical sciences people give enough credit to, I have to say.
Interesting.
And I'd also say that, I mean, this doesn't hold for me. I'm very appreciative of philosophers, even those with whom I disagree, and even if I disagree with them fundamentally. But many people in the empirical sciences are very kind of dismissive of philosophy. And I think they just don't know what they could learn from dealing with philosophers and thinking about the concepts and the assumptions that they have. And sometimes in empirical sciences, you meet people where you think, well, you really need to start thinking about the foundations of what you're doing. When, for example, people are studying a synapse in the hippocampus and they say, this is learning. And you say, well, no, learning is actually a systems effect. This is one little contribution. Yeah, but this is learning. If I turn off the synapse, there is no learning. If I turn the synapse back on, there is learning. So this is learning. Yeah. You're thinking, yeah, come on. You might want to think about systems causes and Enos conditions and things like that. So just there's something there that you might want to learn from philosophy.
Right.
So that's from the viewpoint of scientists. I think scientists are often dismissive of philosophy without knowing it very well. I do think that philosophers are often dismissive of science, possibly because they have these people in mind, but also because they tend to be quite clever, but they're often not as clever as they think. So because I realize it's a philosophy event, so you just better be a little bit more modest and think that often you could be misled. For example, I'll give you a few examples. So when I studied psychology and then later on went to do my PhD, I was in a philosophy of mind discussion group. We self-organized this because those were the days when philosophy of mind wasn't really a big thing in Germany.
Interesting.
And I had the luck to meet many philosophers of mind when I was studying in Bremen at the Hansa Institute of Advanced Studies, organized by Gerhard Roth. He brought in all these philosophers, and I had the chance to meet Thomas Metzinger, Mirko Pauwen, Achim Stephan, Jochen Schröder, all sorts of people like that, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed all these discussions. But I have to say that often the way in which philosophers deal with science is very superficial. And so there's one flavor of philosopher, the kind of philosopher who likes empirical sciences and likes to cite empirical work. So they have their favorite paper, and they always cite their favorite paper, and empirical scientists will just shake their head and kind of cringe when people cite this paper as saying like, well, it's clear we know this. For example, one field where we're working in ourselves is on the precursors to these kind of self-paced decisions. And a lot of philosophers will say, well, I know that this model is correct. We know, and it's absolutely not correct, but it's just kind of popular among philosophers. But so you think, oh, this is it. We've been solved by scientists. It's all, and sometimes I would wish that a little bit more care was taken. If you start using science as a basis for your arguments, you want to make sure that it's good science, or at least that you know the uncertainties in science. And that means don't just pick a random study and just because it fits in what you want to believe and it just supports your position, just pick that and disregard everything else. And another aspect is, and I think this is the unexplored part of philosophy, I think that when you look at the intersection between philosophy and science, certainly in the mind sciences, I'm going to say something very nasty here. I think that the most important things that we can learn as scientists do not come from philosophy of mind, but they come from philosophy of science. Because the way in which we link mental states and brain signals is so complicated and has so many different levels where we need to just think more clearly that I think we can profit more from engaging with philosophers of science than with philosophy of mind, because a lot of debates in philosophy of mind, for example, these ontological debates about whatever you say, well, I'm a property dualist, I'm a substance dualist, I'm a whatever identity theorist, etc. Some of these positions, not the dualistic position, but often the other positions, make the same empirical predictions. So for an empirical scientist, these are completely irrelevant. And they're metaphysical discussions, and it's okay to have these metaphysical discussions, but I'm not interested. So I think thinking exactly about what the interface is between their empirical research program and the philosophical interests, and to be very clear about what can and cannot be taken out of science and the other way around, which philosophical discussions are relevant or not, is really important. And I tend to find my own thinking, when I think about all the philosophy I've done in my life, then I find my way of thinking more influenced by philosophy of science than by philosophy of mind.
Interesting. I do take that point, although I do think somehow that conceptual problems have a certain structure that can appear across different contexts, and you can't really know. I think it definitely helps to be aware of that history of thought in a certain discourse, because every now and then an issue pops up that is reminiscent of what was already discussed in a way. So yeah, I think there could be some kind of a transfer there. But I do take your point that, of course, conceptual clarifications within science and of science are more important for your work than...
I mean, often these things are really pedestrian and simple, the things that scientists can learn from philosophers. And we look for all these really complicated topics. But for example, when people ask, well, what's the most important thing that lay people can learn from brain science? And you come up with, well, is it how our vision works, how our emotions work, how memory works, or something like that? Well, I'd say we still don't really fully understand all these processes in kind of the ultimate kind of depth. But I'd say, well, the one thing that we can definitely tell lay people is that dualism, we've got very good reasons to believe that dualism is not true. So there's a strong convergence there, and given, I mean, we've done some studies on this, looking at the beliefs lay people have about the relationship between mental states and brain states, and I'd say around 90% or more of people are dualists. They hold dualistic beliefs, and I think if we want to start talking about whatever vision, emotions, or whatever, let's start with the very basic. No, there are very, very good scientific reasons to believe that dualism is not correct. When you think something, it happens with your brain.
And do you think then communicating this finding to people is something desirable? Or because I can imagine this having some adverse effects, like, is it legitimate to go around telling people that no, what you think is not really what we know based on evidence? Or...
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. If you think about humanism, one of the kind of key ideas is you want to bring people to do the right thing, so
Right.
and also to the truth.
Right.
So normative and factually being right. But actually it could turn out that bringing people the facts could make them behave worse.
Right.
And there is a little bit of research on this when it comes to free will. Just again to kind of really simplify this discussion, whether if you take away people's belief in free will, well, that means they're going to be less ethical in their behavior.
Right.
So I think that's a discussion that you kind of, as a scientist, I think most scientists would tend to think that, well, believe that in the long run it's always better to tell people the truth, even if there might be some costs. People might get used to it and learn to live with this. And I also think that, there is this beautiful quotation ascribed to Emerson Pugh, which is, there are different versions of this, but if the human brain were so simple that we could understand it, we would be so simple that we couldn't. So that what that means is that our ability to understand ourselves is limited in science, but as lay people, it's even more limited. So for me to really think in my everyday situations, all the reflexive levels of what I'm thinking here is not correct, this is a dualistic belief, and so on, it's actually unmanageable. So you could possibly even ask whether it's possible for humans to find a stable way of stable world view, a belief system that is not dualistic. I don't know if that's possible, but I think it's worth at least thinking about it, what that could be.
Maybe we can stop here and ask Angelina whether there are some questions.
I've received a comment from Professor Dr. Nickel, and it is concerning the Libet experiment. He says, the Libet experiment brings us on the wrong path because the hand movement is not a real action that defines a human being. If I ask, for example, what is 6 times 6, then the answer is predictable, however not determined by brain activity.
Well, we did sort of say already that, yes, that is a response we would frequently get from philosophers, that this isn't really the kind of action we would care about, but it is something that people ordinarily do take to be a form of reaction.
We've done these experiments, these Libet-like experiments, also with mental calculation. So exactly for these reasons, because often people say, oh, well, this is really simple, it's just a twitch or something like that. We, with my PhD student at the time, Chen Seong-sun from Singapore, who's back in Singapore now, we looked at these kind of Libet-style choice prediction experiments and found that you can also predict across a few seconds whether people are going to, for example, add or subtract numbers. So it's not that you can't do that, it's just that the more distinct the choices get, the easier it is to decode them. So you might think that the more complex the decisions are, the more difficult it is to decode them, but it actually gets more simple. So if you, for example, say, which car do you like, or something like that, this is something you can very easily decode because people have strong emotional attachments to car brands and things like that. So all these things, as soon as it comes to beliefs or desires, reasons, etc., it's really easy to decode what people's preferences are and to predict their decisions.
Wow.
The freedom of indifference, as it's sometimes dismissively called, that is something that that's a difficult case. Yeah, and it's the case that people subjectively believe to being most free. So, whether we want to call something an action or not, I'd say depends on your kind of conceptual framework for thinking about actions as well. We could go into that, but yeah.
Oh, that's good, I think. Are there any more questions, Angelina?
No, we don't have any more questions.
Super, thanks. Then for the very end, your new book is out. So can you tell us a little bit about the topic and what's going on there?
Well, this is the first time I've written a book, and I have to say that I'm very hesitant to talk about this because I just feel that it might not be the right framework for doing that. But anyway, so I wrote a book together with a science journalist, Matthias Eckhold. And the reason we did this was because we I wanted to just give explanations for a lot of these questions that people ask me when it comes to the topic of brain reading. So another one of those terrible kind of labels, brain reading. The basic idea there is, can we find out what a person is thinking just based on measurements of their brain activity using machine learning techniques and things like that? So that's something that we kind of outline in this book, and go into topics like free will, thought crimes, limit experiments, and things like that as well. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it does somehow also tap into the free will debate because you use these techniques, or?
Yeah, but so my idea was I wanted to explain something to, say, I had my school teachers in mind or someone. It's not a contribution to a scientific debate. Some of it is, but most of it is not a direct contribution to a scientific debate. It's trying to just explain these ideas, and I think it's actually important that we do that, because I say the taxpayer pays what I do, and I have the duty to explain to people what I'm doing, and I think these topics are really relevant, so this is the way to do that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think this would conclude our session. So we covered, and I hope it was interesting, this notion of free will from the perspective of lay people and neuroscientists and philosophers. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bojana.
Thanks, John.